They were warriors of God, bankers to kings, keepers of secrets no crown dared challenge. The Knights Templar answered only to the Pope, or so we were told. But buried beneath layers of papal decrees and charred trial transcripts lies a different truth. One that doesn't wear a mitre, one that doesn't even wear a helm. It wears a veil. Not a symbol of modesty, but command. Hidden in symbols, whispers, scrubbed from every scroll that dared speak her name. Was the most powerful military order in Christendom quietly ruled by a woman. Let's slow down. Take a breath. The edges of that idea might feel sharp at first, blasphemous even. But that's the point of secrecy, isn't it? To protect power. To protect her. And if you follow the right trail through vanished texts, forbidden rites, and the soft echoes of heresy, something begins to take shape. You're walking along a monastery corridor, stone walls damp with the breath of centuries. The torchlight flickers, as if remembering something it wasn't supposed to. In the corner of your eye there's a carving, just a faint one. A cross, yes. But beside it the outline of a figure. Feminine. Regal. Not Mary, not a saint. Someone else. Someone no one taught you to name. This is the story of that figure. The woman some believe once commanded the Templars not through brute strength or sacred vow, but through reverence and fear. They called her the Veiled Queen. Her legend survived only in shadows, sealed frescoes, redacted letters, ciphers etched into ships and stones. Each clue is a fragment, and each fragment brings us closer to a truth the Church has spent centuries trying to bury. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You kneel beside a replica of a 12th century seal magnifying glass, in hand, tracing the familiar outline of two knights riding a single horse, the classic emblem of the Templar order. But this isn't that seal. It's older, cruder. And instead of two men, there's one knight and a second figure whose robes flow differently, whose posture leans not with the bearing of armor, but with the stillness of command. A figure not grasping reins, but holding something else entirely. A chalice, or perhaps a scroll. Some historians dismiss it as artistic noise, a draft, a misstrike. But if it were truly a mistake, why was it struck at all, and why did it vanish so quickly? The early iconography of the Templars is sparse yet telling. Before the seal was standardized by papal approval, regional variations existed, each telling a slightly different story. In a handful of extant impressions, particularly from the Languedoc region and the Latin East, we find this mysterious female form. She's never named, never explained. But she's not alone in the iconography. One variant seal from Tripoli, dated roughly to 1138, contains an even more startling motif, a knight kneeling not before a cross, but before a veiled figure with a staff and open hand. It's been chalked up to allegory, Marian symbolism, or local artistic quirks. Yet curiously, these depictions vanish entirely by the mid-12th century, right around the time Pope Innocent II formalized the Templar rule and centralized their visual identity. That transition wasn't just aesthetic, it was political. With papal endorsement came scrutiny, and with scrutiny came redaction. The knights had grown too powerful too quickly. Their mystical leanings, tolerated in the early crusades, began to look suspicious. And that veiled figure, it vanished from seals, murals, manuscripts almost overnight. One day she was there, the next she was erased, but not forgotten. In 1911, a private collector in Toulouse revealed a Templar ring from a family estate. Carved into its face was a feminine profile flanked by twin crosses. The woman's eyes were closed, her hair veiled, and beneath her chin the initials VQ La Reine Voilée. the Veiled Queen. Of course, without provenance, skeptics dismissed it as fantasy. But the detail was uncanny. The ring's design matched the metalwork techniques of the 12th century. And more intriguingly, its wear patterns suggested long use, perhaps passed down, perhaps hidden. This is where our mystery deepens. Because if she was only allegory, only symbol, why the need to erase her so completely? Saints and martyrs were not treated this way. Even heretics had names. But this was something else. A deliberate severing, as though acknowledging her would undermine the entire structure the Church hoped to build atop the Templars. It's not just about who she was. It's about what she represented. Not just femininity, but authority, spiritual and temporal. And if the Templars once answered to her, then who anointed her, who protected her, who feared her? Modern Templar researchers remain divided. Some claim the feminine figure was a coded image of Sophia, the embodiment of divine wisdom. Others suggest a more radical possibility that the original founders of the order were inspired by an actual woman, a noble, perhaps even royal, who guided their early structure in secrecy. This theory gained traction after a 1996 re-examination of early Templar charters revealed several oddities, particularly donations made in the name of the Lady without clarification. While Our Lady was a common invocation, the lack of specific Marian language leaves room for interpretation. Yet still mainstream historians balk. Where are the records, the testimonies, the concrete proof? And here we reach the open wound of medieval scholarship silence. Absence isn't evidence of non-existence, especially not when it comes to women in power. Across centuries, powerful female figures were systematically erased, rebranded as saints, or condemned as witches. What if the Veiled Queen escaped both fates by being deliberately forgotten? Her removal from the seals didn't end the whispers. Among local French folklore and regions with Templar strongholds, stories of La Dame Blanche, the White Lady, persisted for generations. Some versions cast her as a tragic specter, others as a protector. But a peculiar few collected by folklorist Camille Delorieux in the 1800s describe her as the one who watches the Red Cross. A woman with no eyes, only a veil, who speaks only when the moon is dark. Some might say coincidence. Archetypes repeat. But why always in places the Templars once called home? Of course, one artifact isn't enough. One seal, one ring, one story. But together they whisper. And if you listen long enough, the absence begins to sound like intent. The vanishing woman in the seal was not a mistake. She was a memory carefully excised. Which begs the question, what were the Templars protecting that the Church feared so deeply? Not a scroll, not a relic, a presence. The monks of Clairvaux were known for their silence. But sometimes silence isn't absence, it's armor. In the heart of the Abbey's once thriving scriptorium, copies of Bernard of Clairvaux's writings were penned with a precision bordering on reverence. His treatise, In Praise of the New Knighthood, is often credited with transforming the Templars from a band of battlefield zealots into an institution of holy authority. What's less often mentioned is the page that's missing. In the 14th century, a version of Bernard's rule commentary surfaced in Lyon. It was copied from a now lost original held at Clairvaux and bound in fine goatskin, though its provenance was disputed. The codex was never printed, never catalogued in any official ecclesiastical inventory. Yet those who examined it in the decades before its disappearance noted a strange anomaly, a heavily scored parchment, its top lines burned away, the margins water-damaged, but legible enough to preserve a single phrase. Usa domina quaedam illis apparuit nocte inter duas vigiles. A certain lady appeared to them between the two vigils. It doesn't take a mystic to sense the weight of that phrasing. This wasn't allegory. Bernard's Latin was spare precise. Domina was not Maria, not Deus, not Virgo, just the lady. No known manuscript today contains that line. It survives only in a 1683 letter written by Brother Eligius of Arles to a fellow Benedictine. Eligius was accused of heretical leanings and quietly reassigned shortly after. His letter, too, was tucked away, discovered in a private library during an estate sale in the 1970s. Its authenticity has been debated ever since. But for those who believe this phrase is a keyhole into a world long buried, it paints a scene both intimate and unsettling, a nocturnal visitation, not divine, not demonic, not metaphor either. An actual presence described as female entering the Templars' spiritual discipline. What kind of woman would merit this space in the foundational writings of their rule? And why would such a passage be burned? Some believe the answer lies in Bernard's own background. He was not merely a theologian. He was a politician, a mystic, and a man who balanced deep piety with strategic manipulation. His relationship with the early Templars was unusually personal. He called them milites Christi, but he also warned them of pride, distraction, and strange voices that could enter the soul under the guise of light. A curious phrasing, especially when juxtaposed with rumors that circulated centuries later. Rumors of a woman in white who offered guidance to Templar initiates during their midnight oaths. The early Cistercian codes make vague mention of silent companions during contemplative hours, spiritual entities perhaps, or veiled metaphors. Yet in at least 2 regional copies of Templar instruction guides from the 13th century, found in ruins near Toulouse and Modena, there are allusions to the one who offers counsel without speech. A feminine figure described not with theological attributes, but with the quiet authority of someone present yet unseen. Perhaps the same woman Bernard alluded to. Perhaps the lady of the lost codex. Of course, this opens a scholarly chasm. Traditionalists argue that even if such a passage existed, it was likely symbolic, an embodiment of wisdom Sophia, or even the Church itself personified as female. But critics counter that Bernard never used this style elsewhere. When he meant the Church, he named it. When he meant the Virgin, he praised her. This lady was something else. In recent decades, certain fringe researchers have pursued a more unsettling theory, that the Templars preserved a living tradition, one that acknowledged a real woman's influence, perhaps even her leadership, not as a mascot or myth, but as a guide, maybe even a founder. Some go so far as to suggest she was alive during the First Crusade, a noblewoman in exile whose spiritual authority was woven into the Templars' DNA before it could be stripped away by papal hands. There's no shortage of objections, of course. No physical trace of such a woman has ever been found. No name, no grave, no portrait. But then again, isn't that the pattern? The missing page from the Codex of Clairvaux is more than an archival curiosity. It's a scar, the kind that marks where something was surgically removed. And when the Church excises, it does so with purpose. One burned page, one vanished manuscript, one phrase that survived only by accident in the handwritten memory of a monk they tried to forget. And yet it echoes. She appeared to them, it said, between the 2 vigils, between matins and lauds, between sleep and waking, between known and unknown, not as a dream, not as a metaphor, as someone whose presence was real enough to be recorded and dangerous enough to be erased. Why? Perhaps because she wasn't meant to be remembered. Or perhaps because remembering her would mean rewriting the story of who founded the most feared and sacred brotherhood in Christendom. The seal had vanished, but the Lady of the Vigil had been there all along, watching, Midnight in a Templar commandery was not silence, it was structure. Candles timed to the hours of prayer, guards patrolling not just for enemies, but for purity, for order. But in a handful of obscure Inquisition records buried beneath the dust of 14th century paranoia, another picture emerges. It's darker, stranger. And it centers on a woman no one dared name aloud. During the 1307 trials that led to the dissolution of the Templars, dozens of knights were interrogated, some tortured, others simply broken by the weight of what they were asked to deny. Among the charges, idolatry, heresy, unnatural acts, and secrecy. One recurring accusation stood out not because of how shocking it was, but because of how carefully it was phrased. Several witnesses referred to a lady in white present during a private initiation rite. She wore a veil, she never spoke. But those who saw her described feeling something, not fear, not holiness, but allegiance. They called her the bride. The term raises eyebrows even now. A bride to whom? To Christ, to the order. To some forgotten vow, and why a veil? Why was her face always hidden, even in accusation? In a 1311 testimony from Aragon, a former Templar named Hugo de Catalanus claimed that during his initiation, he was led blindfolded into a chamber lit only by a single lamp. There he knelt not before a cross, but before a veiled figure who held a sword and a white cloth. The cloth, he claimed, was pressed to his forehead. The sword hovered above his left shoulder. Then he was told the words, "You do not belong to the church. You belong to her." The inquisitor dismissed the tale as hysteria. There's no record of follow-up, but 2 weeks later, Hugo was found dead in his cell. No cause listed. Historians wary of such accounts often frame them as planted testimony shaped by the expectations of the inquisitors designed to shock to fit pre-existing narratives of devilry. And yet the figure of the veiled woman reappears with unsettling consistency, not just in France or Spain, but as far as Hungary and Cyprus. The imagery doesn't change. Always the veil, always the silence, always midnight. The connection to ritual is crucial. Templar ceremonies were famously secretive. Most of what we know comes from enemies, not allies. But even in sanitized, church-endorsed versions, there are gaps, missing lines, redacted pages, instructions left blank. It's almost as if something central had to be removed, forcibly forgotten, yet so intrinsic to the rite that the space it occupied couldn't be hidden entirely. Some theorists argue that this veiled woman was a metaphor again, the feminine divine Sophia Isis, the Shekinah of Kabbalistic lore. Yet these theories falter when one considers the physicality described. Witnesses mention her touch, her weight, as she moved across stone floors, the rustle of her robes, the smell of myrrh. These aren't metaphors. These are sensory imprints, the kind only experience can produce. There's an even older precedent worth noting. In certain Gnostic sects of the early Church, secret rites were administered by women. These figures were called brides of the Logos, intermediaries between the divine word and the initiate. They wore veils to symbolize the hidden nature of truth and to distinguish their authority from the male priesthood. It's possible, then, that the Templars inherited fragments of this older tradition, preserved quietly through oral rites, and embodied literally by a living woman who served as the gatekeeper to the sacred. Could this be the veiled queen herself? Perhaps not. But it's possible she was the origin. Or perhaps even the final echo of a line stretching back through generations of women whose names were never written down, whose influence was meant to be felt, not recorded. The presence of such a ritual figure has implications far beyond medieval pageantry. If the Templars, an order whose very legitimacy depended on papal sanction, allowed or required a woman to serve in a ceremonial role during their most secret rites, it changes everything. It fractures the entire narrative of male-only hierarchy. It suggests duality at the heart of their foundation. It hints at a feminine authority not subordinate but parallel. And it explains the panic. A male heretic can be excommunicated. A female authority hidden and unnamed corrupts the structure invisibly. She doesn't just defy the church. She rewrites its power lines. The callback to Bernard's lost phrase, "a certain lady appeared to them," feels less symbolic now, more rooted. A presence that was meant to be there, that was expected. The rituals weren't invaded by her. They revolved around her. And perhaps the most disturbing element, the silence. Not just hers, but history's. No chronicler wrote of these rites. No artwork depicts her. Nothing survived except whispered confessions under torture, each bearing the same shape: a woman in white. At night. Veiled. Call her allegory. Call her invention. But too many voices across too many centuries said they saw her. And what's most damning of all, none of them said she was frightening. They said she was in charge. In a quiet village tucked beneath the Pyrenean mist, there's a family whose name doesn't appear in the major rolls of France. They aren't royalty. They aren't saints. They're something older keepers, perhaps. For centuries, the Delbelin family of Occitanie has whispered a single phrase to its daughters, passed mother to daughter in the moment between breath and birth. You come from her. No other context. No storybook. Just that. When pressed, the elderly matron, Madame Sylvie Delbelin, smiles and gestures to the attic, where an oak chest holds a genealogical scroll. Faded parchment. Gilt ink. Names you'd expect lords, ladies, a knight or two. But then, around the mid-12th century, a rupture. One name scratched out. Beneath it, written in another hand, a single phrase in Latin: Regina abscondita domina nostra. The hidden queen, our lady. Bloodlines are messy. They defy linearity. But what makes this one dangerous is its impossibility. The dates don't add up. The woman listed as the source would have had to be alive during the founding years of the Templars. Yet no record of her birth or death exists. No surname, no betrothal, no religious order. Just an unbroken maternal chain marked by that same phrase, always in Latin, always in gold ink: you come from her. Of course, skeptics argue it's a family legend invented to elevate status. But the timing is peculiar. The scroll's paper stock matches a known 17th century reconstruction style used by exiled French nobility trying to preserve ancestral claims during the chaos following the wars of religion. And yet the language, particularly the deliberate use of abscondita, suggests something more intimate. Not a queen in hiding, but a queen hidden by design. One not exiled, but protected. Adding to the intrigue is a letter found in the archives of the Carcassonne diocese dated 1702. It references a woman known locally as La Reine Voilée, said to appear during moonless nights near the ruins of a Templar chapel. The writer, a monk named Alaric, cautions against visiting the site, claiming the villagers still honor her with bread and candlelight. He feared a return of the old rites. The church sent no official reprimand, but the chapel was sealed within the year. How does this tie to the Delbelin line? For one, their estate sits less than a mile from that chapel. And in an inventory from 1738, the family records list a ring set with 2 red stones and 1 black forming a triangle. The same configuration appears on a tapestry fragment in the British Museum listed as Templar in origin. The triangle is flanked by a pair of lions not uncommon in heraldry, but these lions both face a central female figure veiled, seated on a throne of stars. No name, no crown, just presence. The implication is subtle but seismic, a matriarchal line tied to Templar iconography, embedded in an otherwise forgotten provincial bloodline. Not royal in the classic sense, but revered. Secretive, perhaps chosen. This isn't merely about a family's claim to legacy. It's about what legacy they were not allowed to claim. If the veiled queen had descendants, they wouldn't wear crowns. They wouldn't command armies. Their survival would depend on silence, on myths and fragments and half-told stories. But they'd carry something, an imprint. Not just genetically, but ritually. A 1924 ethnographic survey conducted in rural Audel recorded a strange custom during funerals among older women in the region. The youngest female relative of the deceased was instructed to pour oil across 3 stones and whisper the words, "For the Mother of the Red Cross." The phrase means nothing to the church, but to a Templar scholar it rings. The Red Cross, the symbol of the order. The mother not as in Mary, but as origin. Source, perhaps ruler. Skeptics could and do dismiss it as folk Catholicism gone odd, but the pattern persists. In every village with known Templar presence there are stories of a veiled woman, a night vigil, a hidden rite led not by a priest, but by a matron. She's called La Dame, or the one who waits, or simply her. No direct identity, no theological ties. Just a constant, unsettling femininity orbiting a brotherhood that on paper swore allegiance only to God and Pope. Even academic records offer a strange omission. In an exhaustive 1892 study of Templar estate inheritance, French historian Léon Aubrac noted a disproportionate number of female-adjacent transfers, where widows' daughters or unnamed female figures appeared in the margins of charters witnessing or approving land exchanges. He found the trend odd, though not suspicious. But what if these weren't just wives or mothers? What if they were watchers? Agents of a lineage not recognized by Rome, but honored by those who knew. The callback to the temple bride rituals adds another layer. If the initiation rites involved a feminine presence, one veiled and reverent, it stands to reason that some orders preserved more than just the gesture. They preserved a bloodline, not biologically for power, but ritually for continuity. That's the uncomfortable possibility that the Templars were not just a brotherhood, but the stewards of a female legacy hidden in plain sight. Not worshipped, not obeyed, protected. The Del Bellin scroll may be a forgery. The ring might be coincidence. The oil ritual superstition. But then again, maybe not. Maybe she lived. Maybe she bore daughters. And maybe the line continued not on thrones or in chapels, but in candlelit attics, in the words whispered between generations. You come from her. Beneath the roots of Gisors Castle, where Norman stone meets the cold breath of the earth, lies a chamber that official maps refuse to acknowledge. The castle itself, perched in the Eure department of northern France, was once a Templar stronghold, strategically vital, steeped in myth. But it's not the towers or battlements that hold the secret. It's what lies beneath. In 1944, a local caretaker named Roger Lemoy began tunneling beneath the donjon tower, driven by stories passed to him from his grandfather, a gravedigger who swore that the Templars had buried something beneath the fortress. For weeks, Lemoy worked in silence. Then one night, he emerged pale and trembling, claiming to have found a sealed chapel underground. He described 12 stone sarcophagi arranged in a circle, and at the center, an altar. Upon that altar, not a cross, not a chalice, a sculpture. A woman seated crowned and veiled. The authorities dismissed the story. His excavation was shut down. No formal search followed. But for those who paid attention, the story didn't die. A handful of photographs, now yellowed and dubious, circulated among esoteric historians, showing part of a stairwell carved into limestone and what appeared to be a pillar bearing a fleur-de-lis. Lemoy was labeled eccentric, even delusional. Yet his descriptions were consistent even in old age and matched the architectural style used by the Templars in the early 13th century. Then came the real twist. In 1964, the French Ministry of Culture quietly ordered a geological survey of the Geysers grounds. No formal reason was given. No results were published. But local records confirm that drilling occurred and that certain areas were resealed immediately afterward. Why among the many legends tied to Geysers is the claim that it was the final resting place of the Templar treasure gold relics, perhaps even the Ark of the Covenant, if you believe the wilder stories. But no mention is ever made in official accounts of a chapel. Certainly not one with a female figure at its heart. Yet the motif matches earlier clues. The veiled woman appears again not as a symbol, but in stone, as an object of reverence positioned at the focal point of a sacred underground space. Lemoy described her posture as regal, her hands resting on her knees, with a pair of lions carved at her feet. Her face, he claimed, was covered by a fine veil carved so delicately it seemed to shimmer. Around the base of the altar was a ring of stars, 12 in all, positioned like the signs of the zodiac. This raises two troubling possibilities. Either Lemoy invented the entire scene in exquisite symbolic detail, or he saw something he wasn't meant to. If his vision was true, the veiled queen was not just ritual or bloodline, she was the center of worship. Worship. That word echoes louder than most. If the Templars built a hidden chapel, sealed it, and guarded it beneath one of their most fortified strongholds, it implies something beyond reverence. It implies devotion. A center for occultic veneration outside the boundaries of Orthodox Christianity. And if she sat on that altar veiled and crowned, it would make her the opposite of every Virgin Mary statue sanctified by Rome. Some fringe theorists propose that the chapel was a mirror sanctuary, a sacred space reserved for an alternate theology. Not heretical in the eyes of the Templars, but too radical for papal eyes. In this view, the woman on the altar isn't just the queen. She's the axis, the embodiment of divine feminine authority hidden where only the worthy could find her. Between rock and silence, between surface and soul. The question that scholars wrestle with is one of function. Why a chapel and why underground? The Templars, after all, were not ashamed of their religious architecture. Their above-ground chapels still stand across Europe, octagonal marvels echoing Solomon's temple. But this chamber, if it existed, was something different. A place not for display, but for secrecy. A ritual space preserved like a seed waiting. There is a precedent. In early Christian communities persecuted by Rome, underground chapels and catacombs often contained unorthodox imagery, feminine divine figures, sacred feasts presided over by women, even symbolic unions between male and female deities. The Church later denounced these as Gnostic distortions. But what if those roots ran deeper and were transplanted into the Templar psyche? Lemoy never published a book. He never profited from his claim. In fact, he died in near poverty, ostracized even by local historians. But his story persists because it matches a pattern too complex to ignore. A veiled woman, a ring of stars, a secret chamber, and a silence that followed. The callback to the Delbelin bloodline feels almost predictive here. The same crowned woman, the same lions, the same sense of guardianship through lineage. Could the chapel have been a place of maternal rite, a space where her successors were blessed, taught, anointed? There's no definitive proof, just whispers, just stories, just a man with a shovel and a memory too elaborate to be accident. But as the French Ministry of Culture keeps Guissors sealed, one has to wonder what's really under that castle gold documents, or a crown that no king was allowed to see. In 1897, a bundle of deteriorating scrolls was discovered wedged behind a false panel in a chapel wall near Tamar, Portugal. The scrolls, now partially illegible, were wrapped in linen and sealed with a simple wax stamp bearing the unmistakable sigil of the Knights Templar, a red cross within a circle. Most of the texts were written in standard Latin and Old Portuguese, but one stood apart. It wasn't a treatise or a charter or even a list of names. It was a cipher. And within it, a woman was hiding. The scroll, now known simply as Codex Eburensis, confounded linguists for over a century. Its script meanders without clear syntax. The symbols repeat irregularly. For decades it was dismissed as a hoax, or worse, a crude imitation of the Voynich manuscript. But in 2008, a team of cryptographers at the University of Coimbra began a new analysis using frequency matching algorithms and comparative Latin phrase databases. What they found wasn't gibberish. It was structured. The cipher was built on a substitution system, layered with astrological and liturgical dates, likely known only to high-ranking members of the Templar inner circle. And one phrase repeated 6 times throughout the document emerged: Mater Lucis Abscondita, the hidden mother of light. Not allegory, not title, designation. The context of the cipher is elusive. It appears to be a series of instructions or perhaps rites anchored to lunar phases and cardinal directions. One passage partially decoded speaks of the mirror at the solstice, another of the cloak passed in silence. But the final lines are the most startling. Rendered roughly, they say, "She whom we shield must not be named, for in her naming lies the end." It's not hard to see why this might never have reached inquisitorial hands. The cipher's construction recalls earlier references: the veiled woman in the seal, the bride of the midnight ritual. But now she has another name, not a proper one still, but a title that implies both reverence and danger. The hidden mother of light, Mater Lucis. It echoes Gnostic themes, yes, but this isn't the loose cosmology of Sophia or Isis. This is embedded, encrypted, preserved through peril. Why code her at all? Why write her into secrecy rather than memory? Perhaps because it wasn't enough to erase her. Perhaps she had to be protected from both enemies and followers. The cipher was locked not by chance, but design. Only someone who knew the liturgical structure of Templar worship, who understood the sacred calendar and the movement of the stars, could unlock her identity. And even then, she remained hidden. This suggests something terrifyingly intimate. The Templars weren't just obeying her, they were safeguarding her. And more than that, they feared what her revelation might bring. As if naming her would cause collapse. As if she wasn't a relic of the past, but an active force latent, waiting, shielded. The cipher offers more than just worship. It suggests hierarchy. A passage crudely translated reads, "Above the commander, the light. Above the light, the cloak. And beneath the cloak, she." That's not doctrine. That's structure. A diagram of power. And at the top of it, veiled not in secrecy, but in necessity, a woman. Was this woman symbolic, a living person, a bloodline, an embodiment of a higher force? The scholarly debate remains unresolved. Some point to the Order of the Temple's links with ancient mystery traditions, suggesting a holdover from Egyptian or Chaldean rites. Others insist this was a singular historical woman, elevated, mythologized, and encrypted to ensure her memory could not be purged. The callback to Guissors is impossible to ignore. A chapel hidden underground. A woman enthroned at its center. Now we find her again here, not carved in stone but woven into cipher, not worshipped openly but spoken of only in layers of code. If Gizor's was her temple, perhaps Codex Eberensis was her liturgy. It also offers a bridge to the bloodline in Occitanie. The triangle sigil noted on the Del Bellin ring matches three glyphs that appear in the cipher, always together, always at the start of an instruction. They may mark her name, or worse, her orders. She wasn't just a figurehead. She gave commands. The notion unsettles even the most open-minded scholars. A woman not merely revered, but obeyed by warriors who claimed to kneel only before God. It turns everything inside out. The veil is no longer just a metaphor for concealment. It's a tactical device. It allowed her to exist above scrutiny, unseen, untouched, unburned. This much is clear: the cipher wasn't written for us. It was written to survive us. And in that survival, it carried her forward unnamed but undefeated. Mater lucis abscondita. Not just hidden on purpose. The year is 1131. The Kingdom of Jerusalem stands not as a battered outpost, but as a beacon, a crusader stronghold carved into the heart of the Levant, ruled not by a war-hardened knight, but by a woman. Melisande, queen regnant, not consort, not widow, crowned in her own right. Her name echoes through the halls of history, but never loudly. That's how they preferred it. Melisandre's rule co-sovereign with her husband Fulk of Anjou, then her son Baldwin III, was one of balance and quiet defiance. Fluent in Greek, Arabic, and Latin, she moved with effortless diplomacy between cultures. She restored churches, funded monasteries, restructured the kingdom's administration. But more than that, she did something unspoken. She commanded. And she did so in a time and place where women were rarely allowed to breathe, let alone rule. In the Templar archives, what remains of them, her name appears only sparingly. A few mentions of donations, a note of her attending a consecration. But in the Chronicle of Ernoul, written in the late 12th century by a squire who served under the Knights of the Hospital, there's a more curious anecdote. He refers cryptically to the woman who whispered to the temple. No name, no title. Just a suggestion that the order, still in its formative years, looked east, not just for battle, but for guidance. It wouldn't have been impossible. Melisande's court was centered in Jerusalem at the same time the Templars were headquartered at Al-Aqsa Mosque, rebranded as the Temple of Solomon. Her influence would have been felt in every administrative decision, every political ripple. She was, in many ways, the beating heart of Latin Jerusalem. And yet her full power is always footnoted, quieted, cloaked. One obscure letter housed in the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana, dated 1134, and unsigned, references the sister of the temple. The language is cautious, even reverent. Her judgment steadies the blade. Her gaze guides the falcon. The letter, addressed to an unknown recipient within the church hierarchy, is clearly referring to a woman with influence over Templar decisions. Most assume it refers to Melisande. But the tone goes beyond flattery. It borders on allegiance. If Melisande was the inspiration for the veiled queen, she was more than symbolic. She was precedent. She was proof that a woman could wield ecclesiastical and military power in tandem. Her reign saw the flourishing of Eastern Christian art, especially depictions of the Virgin, not as a sorrowful mother, but a crowned sovereign. That iconography, Mary as ruler rather than penitent, appears later in some of the more esoteric Templar sites, notably in Portugal and southern Italy. Melisande's illuminated Psalter, a manuscript produced under her patronage, shows the Queen of Heaven enthroned, veiled in gold, surrounded not by angels, but by robed men bowing before her. That image, while ostensibly Marian, carries something deeper. A hidden message, a mirror. But Melisande wasn't without enemies. Folk tried to limit her power. Rumors swirled of an unnatural bond between her and her cousin Hugh, Count of Jaffa. When Hugh rebelled, folk seized his lands and sought to isolate Melisande. It didn't work. By 1136, she had outmaneuvered her husband, reclaimed her authority, and essentially ruled alone for nearly 2 decades. Yet curiously, by the time of her death in 1161, official histories had begun to downplay her achievements. Chroniclers softened her image, reframed her sovereignty as maternal stewardship rather than strategic command. Her rule became a shadow in the narrative of Jerusalem. The sword she carried became a harp, and this is where she intersects the larger mystery. If the veiled queen was not a singular being, but a recurring archetype appearing in ritual, in bloodline, in cipher, then Melisande may have been the one who gave her historical form. Not the queen, but a queen. One powerful enough to inspire replication, to become the prototype for what the Templars may have sought to preserve in secret. The callback to the cipher is worth noting here. Mater lucis abscondita, hidden mother of light. Melisande was once called the Light of Jerusalem in an Arabic poem preserved in a Cairo manuscript. The phrasing is eerie in its similarity. Coincidence, perhaps. But the Templars thrived on convergence of myth-symbol-fact. A phrase was never just a phrase, it was a doorway. And then there is the matter of her burial. Melisande was laid to rest in the Church of the Virgin in the Valley of Jehoshaphat, a site with eschatological importance. Tradition holds it is where the Last Judgment will occur. The location is curious, powerful, almost chosen. And when her tomb was opened briefly during the 19th century explorations, it was found to be nearly empty, contents relocated, records vague. The bones of the first ruling queen of Jerusalem disappeared into silence. Melisande, the sovereign who ruled beside the temple, who may have whispered to its warriors who dared to wear the crown without apology, now rests nowhere. She may not have been the veiled queen, but she proved one could exist. In the basement of a crumbling monastery near Avignon, a fire was set. Not by accident, not in haste. This was methodical, a quiet attempt to erase paper, not people. Monks with tongs and gloved hands feeding parchment into a blackened hearth. The year was 1312. The Pope had just dissolved the Templars. Their leaders were imprisoned, their wealth seized. Their story, it seemed, was over. But some documents survived. One bundle later retrieved from the soot by a junior scribe who chose curiosity over obedience, contained fragments of correspondences, letters between ecclesiastical officials, nobles, and one particular knight commander whose name was scratched out in nearly every instance. What caught the scribe's attention wasn't the Latin. It was the frequency of a certain phrase, Domina Superioris Ordinis, the Lady of the Higher Order. The language is peculiar. Superioris Ordinis was rarely used outside papal bulls. It denoted an authority that superseded rather than supported. And the Domina, that wasn't Mary. That wasn't allegory. This lady was referenced with the same diplomatic caution used for royals and popes. One letter from a bishop in Limoges warns, "Do not speak her name aloud." Even now, her shadow touches the knighthood. Another unsigned but dated 1303 simply says, "Her seal bore no crown, yet men knelt." These letters were not drafted for the public. They were internal, protective. They reek of anxiety. Something about this woman, not just her existence, but her influence, threatened the hierarchy. She wasn't a heretic. She wasn't a rebel. She was within. And that made her dangerous. Of the 16 partial letters recovered from the attempted Burning 7 reference, a sigil, 2 intertwined circles, surrounding an upright triangle. The symbol matches etchings found in the underground vaults of geysers. One letter mentions it being carved onto a reliquary. Another describes it sewn into the hem of a ceremonial robe, used only when the knights convened beyond the wall of Rome. That phrasing, beyond the wall, has long puzzled scholars. It might refer to a spiritual threshold, or perhaps a literal meeting place outside papal control. Then there is the most compelling document, a letter addressed to Pope Boniface VIII, unsigned, likely sent through diplomatic intermediaries. It begins respectfully, then sharply pivots. The writer begs the Holy Father to halt inquiries into the Eastern woman. She is described as sanctified by the temple, though not of the cloth. The letter warns, the more you search, the more she disappears. Her power lies not in presence, but in the loyalty of those who never speak her name. This letter was nearly destroyed. Only its edges were burned. The ink bled, but endured. Its tone is not defiant. It's frightened, as if the writer knew that discovery would break something foundational, something held together by mutual silence. It calls to mind Melisande, the heretic queen who ruled in light and shadow. It echoes the cipher's ominous refrain, for in her naming lies the end. And it connects chillingly to the Templar initiation rituals, where silence was the final vow. The Church's need to burn these letters suggests they weren't just inconvenient. They were explosive. Each one chipped away at the fantasy of the all-male divine hierarchy. Each one implied that a woman unnamed, unthroned, unrecorded, was operating behind or within the most disciplined religious military order in Europe, and not just once. The correspondences span over 4 decades, from 1268 to 1309. That's not rumor. That's longevity. The Church didn't just fear a rogue mystic or a scandalous affair. They feared an institution, a presence older than any pope's reign, embedded like bone under flesh. Some historians suggest that these letters refer not to a living woman, but a spiritual tradition, a goddess figure, a feminine Holy Spirit. But the vocabulary says otherwise. The writers speak of her movements, her advice, her seal. These are actions, not myths, not metaphors. The callback to the Codex Eberensis becomes sharper now. The cipher's reference to Mater Lucis, the hidden mother of light, feels less esoteric and more grounded. If these letters are real, then she wasn't just hidden. She was active. She influenced, she protected, and she terrified them. One burned letter contains an incomplete inventory. Among the items listed, a robe of ash gray veiled at the hood, a scroll bearing 12 stars, and most intriguingly, an empty coffer, opened only by her hand. The specificity is striking. Not sacred relics, personal items, ritual tools perhaps, and the insistence on her exclusivity. The key belonging only to her speaks of rank, not reverence, command. So we return to the question the Church never wanted asked. Who was she? Not just a name, a role, a crown that never gleamed in daylight, a hand that guided without ever signing a document. She remains unnamed in the surviving texts, but the silence surrounding her is louder than any decree. She is absence carved into parchment, smoke that refused to vanish. The Church tried to burn her memory, but ashes are only light in disguise. There is a story told in hushed tones along the Iberian borderlands of a woman who never raised her voice, but whose words reshaped the course of lives. She wore red not as vanity, but as vow. Her face always obscured her steps, untracked. Yet men traveled weeks through dust and silence just to kneel in her presence and ask a single question: what comes next? In the preserved oral traditions of rural Aragon, the Dama del Silencio appears again and again. Some call her a ghost, others a saint, and a few those who remember the old stories call her Oráculo de la Cruz Roja, the Oracle of the Red Cross, not a prophet in the biblical sense, something stranger. A woman said to possess knowledge no one should hold, maps to buried cities, the names of unborn kings, the day the sun would blacken before a great fire, too fanciful perhaps. But then, a 15th-century Templar inventory, catalogued posthumously by the monks of San Juan de la Peña, listed among its relics una tela roja con símbolos astrológicos usada por la hermana del velo durante la consulta. A red cloth with astrological symbols used by the veiled sister during the consultation. No date, no signature, just the phrase, the consultation. The term does not appear in any traditional church lexicon. It has no liturgical counterpart. And yet the way it is used implies familiarity, formality, repetition. A rite. A role. This is where the figure of the oracle begins to slip from folklore into the domain of structure. Because if the Templars included a formalized moment, a consultation with a specific veiled woman, they weren't merely including the feminine. They were depending on it. Some historians argue that the oracle is nothing more than an evolved folk memory of the Sibyls, those ancient prophetesses of Roman myth. But the Templars weren't romantics. They were meticulous, structured, hierarchical. The notion that a woman veiled and silent sat at the heart of a formal Templar ritual, not as decoration, but as authority, challenges everything we've been told about the order's internal world. Consider this: an obscure 13th-century rulebook fragment found in Braga, Portugal, mentions a figure called Soror Nona Sister 9. She is described as the one who sees with the inner light and is only present when the moon sleeps. Her role to deliver the final counsel before new Templar appointments. She is not named again, and her presence is explained only through analogy. As the grain bends to the wind, so shall the command bend to her voice. That voice, according to lore, was rarely heard directly. The oracle did not speak in public and never during daylight. Messages were conveyed through cloth signs, tokens, or assigned proxies. In this way, her advice retained a sacred ambiguity. She didn't dictate. She revealed. Of course, this opens the gates of speculation. Was she a singular person, a role passed through generations, a bloodline descended from the same hidden matriarch whispered about in Occitanie and veiled in stone beneath geysers? There's something haunting in how the descriptions align. The robe of gray, the triangle of stars, the ritual silence, and always, always the veil not of submission, but of deliberate mystery. Veiling not to conceal weakness, but to shield power from unworthy eyes. The callback to the Church's burnt letters now glows more ominously. The Lady of the Higher Order, Domina Superioris Ordinis, could well have been this oracle. Not allegorical, embodied. A woman who counseled those in power without ever wearing the trappings of it herself. And what of the consultation itself? No full rite has survived. But fragments persist. A limestone tablet unearthed near Tomar in 1931 bears a circle of symbols, astrological signs, crosses a pair of open eyes at the center. Beneath it, the words, "Only in silence is she heard." The artifact was dismissed as pseudo-historical until a matching sketch turned up in the margins of the Codex Eburensis. The implication: the Templars encoded her, not just in language, but in geometry. Her counsel, her position, her divinity. This demands a re-evaluation of the order's entire spiritual architecture. Because if the oracle was real, if she sat at the heart of their decision-making, if her word bent strategies and blessed missions, then the Templars were not merely knights. They were disciples. She didn't wear armor. She wore certainty. She didn't ride horses. She sent messages in symbols. She didn't shout. She whispered, and they obeyed. The academic resistance to this idea remains fierce. After all, the Templars are one of the last sacred myths of Western masculinity chivalry in armor brotherhood without blemish. But history doesn't care about comfort. It leaves stains, and under enough scrutiny, those stains begin to resemble faces, veiled, female, watching. The Oracle of the Red Cross may not appear in Vatican registers, but neither did the ritual, neither did the ciphers, neither did the consultations beneath moonless skies. But someone was there, and the order moved when she spoke. She stands in niches across Europe cradling a child cloaked in shadow, her face the color of volcanic stone. The Black Madonna. To some, she is a version of Mary adapted for local sensibilities. To others, she's a relic of pagan transition, a soot-darkened icon preserved by time and candle smoke. But to the Templars, her meaning may have been altogether different. Not soot, not stain, not metaphor, a signal. At first glance, her imagery doesn't startle. The Virgin seated or standing, often holding the infant Christ. Sometimes crowned, sometimes not. But the texture of her depiction is unmistakable, somber, maternal, regal, but also defiant. Unlike traditional Marian statues, the Black Madonna rarely smiles. She gazes, eyes fixed forward, veil-heavy posture upright. There's no softness here, no passivity. And then there are the placements. Of the known Black Madonna shrines in France, nearly 1/3 fall within a 10-kilometer radius of former Templar holdings. In Spain, the number jumps. In the region of Catalonia alone, 6 of the oldest shrines coincide with Templar structures, and in central Italy, nestled in caves and high hilltop chapels, she appears again, always cloaked, always watching. Scholars have long debated her meaning. Was she a holdover from earlier goddesses Isis, Cybele, Diana recast in Christian form, or was she a racialized evolution of Mary drawn from Eastern traditions the Crusaders encountered? These interpretations have weight. But none explain the pattern. Why did the Black Madonna matter so much to the Templars? An unexamined clue lies in a letter from 1242 recovered from the Abbey of Orval, addressed to a knight preceptor stationed in Provence. It bears the cryptic instruction, "Build near the mother's shadow, not her light. For in her shadow, the truth remains whole." A strange command, unless one considers the visual contrast between the white Madonna glowing exalted and the Black Madonna obscured, veiled, solemn. Not lesser, just hidden. A carved inscription beneath the Black Madonna of Rocamadour, a major pilgrimage site with Templar influence, depicts not the Christ child, but a triangle of stars beneath her throne. This symbol, familiar now from the cipher and the Del Belen ring, reappears subtly in other Black Madonna installations, usually woven into the bas relief or embroidered at the hem of her garment. What if these weren't mere artistic flourishes? What if these were markers? Some researchers believe the Templars viewed the Black Madonna not as Mary at all, but as an embodiment of the veiled queen, a secret patroness hidden beneath an acceptable symbol, a spiritual decoy, one that allowed her veneration to continue without drawing fire from the Church. After all, the Church tolerated Black Madonnas, even canonized certain shrines, but they never paid close attention. They didn't ask why she kept showing up in the same places the Templars had built, fought, and died. A 12th century hymn preserved in Santiago de Compostela refers to La Dama Oscura la Fuerza, que guía, the dark lady, the force that guides. It is sung not in Latin, but in Galician Portuguese. The lyrics never mention Mary. They speak instead of veils of fire behind silence of a mother with no child, only light. Is this the same woman who appeared in the Codex Eburensis, who presided in stone beneath geysers, who was consulted in the red-veiled rites of Portugal possibly? Probably. Because the deeper you look, the more the Black Madonna ceases to be an image and becomes a placeholder. She holds space for memory, for reverence, for something once real. The callback to the oracle is poignant here. The silence, the darkness, the distance between the sacred and the spoken. The oracle whispered. The Black Madonna stares. Neither explains themselves. And then there's the matter of the child. In traditional depictions of Mary, the Christ child is central, celebrated, emphasized. But in many Black Madonna statues, the child is diminutive, secondary, or missing altogether. In some cases, the Madonna holds a scroll instead, or a sphere, or nothing at all. One 14th century carving found in a crypt beneath Montserrat shows her seated alone, veiled hands resting on her lap, empty. No child, no cross, no gesture of blessing, only waiting. This, some argue, is the original form, not Mary with Christ, but the veiled queen alone, in stillness, in shadow, not mothering a savior, but guarding a secret. A final clue emerges in the diary of a Jesuit traveler named Antonius del Valle, who in 1603 visited over 20 Black Madonna sites across southern Europe. His notes are methodical, but one entry stands apart. At a ruined chapel near Girona, he described a Black Madonna whose face had been scraped away. On the base, carved in crude Latin Mater Verae Regulae, Mother of the True Rule. The Templar rule was the order's foundation, a document supposedly dictated by Bernard of Clairvaux, emphasizing poverty, chastity, obedience. But if there was another rule, one hidden, older, feminine, it would explain the need for such shadows. It would mean the order didn't merely serve Christendom, it served her. It always begins with a cup, gleaming, glorious, lost. The Holy Grail has haunted Western imagination for centuries, described as everything from Christ's chalice to a stone fallen from the stars. But strip away the poetry, the quests, the sanctified fanfare, and something stranger surfaces. Not what the Grail is, but who it belongs to. Because before it was a relic, it was a story. And before it was a story, it was a woman's. In the earliest versions of the Grail legend, those unpolished Pré-Chrétien de Troyes texts, spoken in Old Occitan and Breton rhyme, the Grail doesn't belong to a knight. It doesn't even reside in a temple. It is borne by a woman, not just carried, but guarded. Described as the Grail Maiden, she is neither lover nor reward. She is keeper, sovereign over the object that heals, nourishes, reveals. The Grail is not her accessory. It is her charge, and she is no damsel. In Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival, one of the most revered Grail epics, the Grail isn't even a cup. It's a stone, and it is guarded not by monks or angels, but by a lineage of noble women known as the Templars, a word that bears an uncanny resemblance to the Templar name. Here again, the feminine holds the center of power. Not in the periphery, but at the heart of the mythos. The Church didn't like that. By the time the Grail cycle became formalized into Christian allegory, the woman was diminished, turned into a symbol of purity, then silenced, then erased altogether. The Grail passed to male hands. Knights quested, kings suffered. The feminine vanished except for whispers, except for her. One of the earliest Grail manuscripts, a 12th century fragment now held in Bern, Switzerland, contains an unusual marginal note. It reads, "The Grail is not found, it is revealed, and only she reveals it." No attribution. Just that line scrawled beside a passage describing the arrival of the Grail Maiden. So who was she? Some say the Virgin Mary. Others, Mary Magdalene. But those identities feel retrofit attempts to staple Christian comfort onto a myth that predates the stitching. The Grail's origin in its rawest form is older than cathedrals, older than knights. It belongs to a current of tradition that venerated wisdom not as law but as lineage. Enter the veiled queen. Imagine her not in armor but in authority, not holding a sword, but something far more dangerous, secrecy. The power not to conquer, but to conceal. If the Grail was more than myth, if it was a symbol of spiritual sovereignty or a vessel containing hidden knowledge, then its guardian was never meant to be loud. She was meant to endure. And that's exactly what she did. The callback to the Black Madonna is unmissable. A woman seated veiled, holding not a child, but a container. A mystery. She does not offer it. She shows it, and only to the one worthy. Only to the one who understands that the true Grail isn't taken. It is accepted. Certain fringe scholars, those considered more romantic than rigorous, suggest that the Grail itself was once the symbol of her rule. A royal insignia passed through hands, then myths, then symbols. In this reading, the Grail Maiden and the Veiled Queen are the same figure, splintered by time, refracted into stories designed to entertain more than enlighten. But evidence persists. A manuscript found in 1906 in the private collection of a Portuguese noble family known as the Livro do Velo contains a passage about a red-cloaked guardian of the sacred basin who rules beneath the moon and guides the knights through silence. The passage appears in the context of a Templar journey, part myth, part itinerary. But the phrasing is unique. Not Grail exactly, but basin. Not chalice, but depth. And again, it is ruled over, not owned. In the Templar cipher, too, the image recurs. One of the coded glyphs now believed to represent the queen is always accompanied by a symbol resembling a cup, but not upright, inverted, as though pouring out, as though offering, or empty. And that is perhaps the cruelest irony, that the Grail, this supposed male quest for divine favor, was never about possession. It was about remembrance, about returning to the source. And the source, it seems, wore a veil. The question now becomes one of reversal. What if the Grail was never lost? What if it was hidden not by accident, but by design, by the very woman tasked with guarding not the object, but the wisdom it held? A feminine lineage passed not through blood, but through silence. A truth so radical, so subversive, that only the worthy would ever find it. The callback to the oracle is clear. She didn't speak. She revealed. The Veiled Queen did the same. The Grail was never meant to be won. It was meant to be understood. And in that light, the most famous quest in history becomes something else. Not a chase, a test. And only those who looked past the sword, past the crown, past the cross, would see her at the end of the path, seated, veiled, and waiting. Paris, 1314. The wind rolled off the Seine with a winter bite, and smoke wreathed the island's square like a warning no one heeded. At the center stood Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, chained, condemned, and burning. History records his final words as a curse, an invocation of vengeance directed at the king and pope who orchestrated the order's downfall. But in the moment before the flames consumed him, witnesses describe a murmur, not rage, a whisper just loud enough to rattle the air, aimed not at Philip IV or Clement V, but beyond them. She still waits in shadow. The chroniclers of the day ignored it. They had other stories to shape. But the line survives not in official accounts, but in the recollections of a Florentine merchant who claimed to be in the crowd. His letter, preserved in a family archive and rediscovered in the 19th century, is brief and weathered, but his final note is chilling. He looked east when he said it. East, toward Jerusalem, or something older. De Molay was no fool. He'd endured years of imprisonment, torture, the slow crumbling of everything the Templars built. And yet, on the pyre with his body failing and every worldly structure turned against him, he uttered not a prayer, not a scream, but a cryptic reference to a woman hidden in darkness. The Church dismissed it as madness, but they always do. There's a curious symmetry here. The Templars began in the Holy Land, men bound by a rule they claimed to have received from on high, shaped in part by Bernard of Clairvaux, refined by shadowed experience. And now, at the Order's official death, their leader circles back to a veiled presence. She isn't named, she isn't explained, but she is there on his tongue at the edge of flame and memory. And that's not all. In a hidden cell once used to hold Templar prisoners in Chinon, France, a piece of graffiti etched in stone depicts a seated woman with no face, just lines, angular, deliberate. At her feet, a cross. But not the Templars' usual red here, it's blackened either with soot or design. Beneath the figure are 3 words, expectat in tenebris. She waits in the shadows. The match is impossible to ignore. It's not just de Molay's final breath. It's part of a pattern, one that stretches back through the cipher, the Black Madonna, the rituals, the bloodline. She has no name. She never needed one. She exists in the liminal space between memory and myth, where power lingers after names have burned. Some scholars argue that de Molay's words were metaphor, that the she in question referred to the Church, the Order, perhaps even truth itself. But those who've traced the deeper thread, the hidden feminine in Templar history, hear something else. They hear recognition. A final nod to the presence who guided them, shielded them, perhaps even ruled them. And it wasn't the first time he mentioned her. In a sealed deposition found among the Vatican's Chinon parchments documents, made public only in the 21st century, de Molay is asked whether the Order had secret rites. His answer is vague, evasive. But he mentions rites older than Rome. When pressed, he says, they were given to us by one who came before. She who is never named. She who is never named. The callback to the cipher's warning. For in her naming lies the end now strikes deeper. Was this secrecy ritual, reverence, or survival? Perhaps all 3. De Molay's final words, so quiet, so strange, take on weight when paired with everything we've seen. The veiled woman in the seal, the lost codex, the oracle, the Black Madonna. Each a chapter in a silent chronicle, erased and rewritten a dozen times, but never entirely gone. And now at the Order's end, he acknowledges her. Not to defy his captors, not to spark legend, but to pass the thread, to leave behind one last piece of the tapestry, so that someone someday would begin to tug, and perhaps understand. She still waits in shadow. The convent walls were thick, silent. Not monastic silence, but something deeper, a practiced stillness, as if every stone had agreed long ago to forget how to echo. Tucked in the forests of southern France and northern Italy, these communities wore names familiar enough to pass unnoticed, the Sisters of St. Mary Magdalene. At first glance, nothing about them suggested mystery. Their chapels were modest, their habits plain. But those who stayed long enough, those who asked the wrong questions, began to notice what was missing. No confessions were heard, no mass was publicly held, and the abbesses never answered to Rome. The Magdalene orders have long occupied a shadowy space in church history, officially existing, unofficially tolerated. Most were founded as refugees for penitent women, reformed sinners, or widows seeking quiet lives. But the deeper you look into their registries, the fewer names appear. One 14th-century ledger from Avignon lists 27 nuns, all signed only with initials. No dates of entry, No recorded dowries, no transfers out. They were ghosts in habit. One chapel deep in the hills near Carcassonne contains a fresco so faded it's nearly invisible unless lit from the right angle. It shows a veiled woman seated beneath a starry dome, flanked not by angels or apostles, but by two knights. Both kneel. One bears the familiar Templar cross. The abbey that housed this image was burned in 1572 during the French Wars of Religion. No official reason was given, but an archived letter from a local bishop claimed the sisters harbored a theology unsuitable to public faith. He never elaborated. He didn't need to. The iconography tells the story. Unlike traditional female orders that emphasized humility and service, the Magdalene communities had a peculiar trait, autonomy. Most were founded not by bishops, but by private patrons, often nobles with Templar ties. One established outside Toulouse in 1204 was built on land deeded by a knight named Jean de Laurac, whose family crest featured a veiled star. The deed contains a strange clause that no male cleric may enter the sanctuary within the sanctuary, and that once inducted, the sisters must speak of the Queen to none outside the veil. The Queen, not Mary, not Christ's mother, but someone else, someone beneath the veil. Was this the veiled Queen herself? Perhaps not literally, but the language, the secrecy, the deliberate isolation, it all points to preservation. These weren't ordinary convents. They were vaults, human repositories of ritual memory and doctrine too dangerous to be kept in script alone, and they didn't vanish. In 1811, a Napoleonic census listed a surviving Magdalene house near Piedmont. It described the sisters as mute and self-sufficient. When asked about the nature of their order, the abbess responded only with the phrase, lux in abscondito, light in hiding. The callback to Mater Lucis Abscondita, the hidden mother of light, is unmistakable. The cipher whispered it. The letters the church tried to burn alluded to it. The Templar graffiti at Chinon carved it in stone. And now here it was again, on the lips of a nun in a forgotten valley centuries later. If these orders preserved anything, it wasn't just memory. It was methodology, a way of being, of surviving. They knew that to endure, they couldn't shout. They had to whisper. They had to veil. They had to outlast the inquisitions and flames and slow forgetting. And so they did. In their rituals, what little has been reconstructed, there are echoes of Templar structure. Midnight vigils, silent processions, circles of 12. No Eucharist but oil anointings. No sermons, only readings from unnamed scrolls. One fragment found buried beneath a collapsed wall near Avignon reads, "She who sees without sight commands without sound. A rule, a vow, or a memory, it's unclear." But again, the figure reemerges, not as figurehead, as foundation. The Magdalene identity itself may have served as camouflage. Mary Magdalene, the redeemed sinner turned apostle, provided the perfect cover for a more radical truth, a hidden matriarchal tradition wrapped inside the folds of repentance. To Rome, they were poor sisters atoning for past sin, but behind closed doors, they were archivists, custodians, a quiet resistance. There is no record of the Magdalene orders participating in violence, rebellion, or overt heresy. They didn't need to. Their defiance was in being, in existing, in keeping her name, whatever it was, alive, even if only in symbol and silence. The callback to de Molay's final whisper now feels like a thread between epochs. She still waits in shadow, he said. And perhaps this is what he meant, that she had not vanished, not died, not been extinguished by papal decree. She had simply shifted, hidden herself within the folds of cloth and stone and memory, entrusted her legacy not to kings, but to women who understood that power never survives through visibility. It survives through vow, through silence, through sisterhood. The Magdalene orders did not guard a relic. They were the relic. In the darkened archives of the Vatican, there is a term whispered among the more curious archivists, not printed, not catalogued, but passed mouth to ear like a confession, liber albus. The White Scroll. Said to contain a genealogy of forbidden origins, its pages, if they ever existed, have never been seen in the modern age. But the rumors persist. So does the fear. The White Scroll was referenced only twice in surviving historical documents. The first instance comes from a 17th-century Jesuit commentary on heretical texts, in which the author writes dismissively of a scroll once feared to contain the line of the hidden lady, long since lost to time or buried in ash. The second, more cryptic mention appears in a marginal note scrawled in the Vatican Codex B 1123 beside a paragraph about suppressed Templar confessions. The note reads, "Names are not erased. They are folded into the white. Folded into the white. Not erased. Hidden." That's the scroll's whispered function, to record the lineage not of kings or saints, but of women whose power flowed invisibly through the Templar order, guarded not by charter or coronet, but by secrecy. Not a book of theology, but of ancestry. A map of the matrilineal thread the Church could never quite cut. The disappearance of the scroll is, of course, convenient. Some say it never existed. Others believe it still does, locked in a private vault, misfiled intentionally, or destroyed without record. But a letter dated 1786, written by an archivist named Donato Bellori to his cousin in Florence, describes a scroll of pale vellum bearing no title with ink that disappears under light. He claims it was shown to him only briefly, and that it contained a crown, a veil, and a string of female names leading back to a date before Hugues de Payens. Then he writes, "I was told to forget." Bellori was dismissed from his post 2 years later. What makes the story plausible isn't the scroll's content, but the lengths to which the Church has gone to suppress even its whisper. A 19th-century French historian, Étienne Lacroix, published a short essay speculating that the Templars might have preserved a non-royal but influential female bloodline. Within weeks of publication, he was publicly excommunicated and denounced as blasphemously imaginative. His publisher pulled the essay from circulation. Only 2 physical copies remain. Why such ferocity over speculation? Because names are dangerous. If the veiled queen existed, whether as a ruler, oracle, or spiritual matriarch, then those who descended from her might still walk among us, not cloaked in gold or ritual, but in the mundane. And if a scroll proved such a line, the entire patriarchal framework of divine authority might crack. The callback to the Magdalene orders sharpens this point. Those silent sisters didn't just keep traditions, they preserved memory, and memory is the most dangerous weapon against erasure. If the scroll was real, it would have been entrusted to someone who understood the weight of veils, the burden of silence. Someone who knew not to speak, but to remember. To keep the names not aloud, but alive. In a 14th-century Flemish illumination titled Ars Mulieris, a robed figure stands before a scroll, eyes closed. Her veil covers her mouth, but not her hand, which reaches toward a symbol shaped like a double spiral. The inscription reads, "Non in oribus sed in ossibus," not in ears, but in bones. The phrase recurs again in a coded passage from the Templar cipher, this time next to the glyph scholars now associate with the Queen. The implication her legacy was not written. It was embodied. The White Scroll then may not have been one scroll. It may have been many, passed quietly, hidden in the spines of hymnals behind false walls between generations of women whose names never reached the altar. Or maybe it was just one, and it was burned. But the burning of a scroll doesn't end the truth it carried. It only transfigures it into stories, into rituals, into myths whispered in convents and carved into stone. The scroll disappears. The memory lingers, just like her. On a wind-swept hill near Tamar, Portugal, there rises a stone tower whose color deepens with each passing century, more rust than red, now more memory than monument. Locals call it Torre Vermelha, the Red Tower. It sits apart from the main Templar complex, slightly crooked, partially crumbled, yet never entirely forgotten. Some say it was a watchtower. Others say it was a prison. But buried within a folk tale told only to those who ask kindly and wait for the second cup of wine is a different account. They say a woman lived there, not imprisoned, married. The story passed down through stonemasons' lore and fragments of 16th century regional poetry speaks of a cloistered noblewoman, nameless, always veiled, who was wed in secret to a high-ranking Templar. The ceremony, never sanctioned by the church, was witnessed only by a circle of knights and the Mother of the Well. Her veil was red. Her vow was never to bear children, only to remember. It sounds like legend. It probably is. And yet the tower itself bears a carving just above the inner lintel, a triangle flanked by two crossed swords and a small circle at its center. This same sigil appears, though smaller and more discreet, on a gravestone in the Tamar Chapel's east wing. No name. Just the date 1214. That year marks no famous battle, no papal bull, no royal decree. But in the Tomar archives there is a single reference to a ceremony held at the edge of the rule. A phrase deliberately opaque, but evocative. The rule as in the Templar rule. Or something older. Something hidden among the papers recovered from the nearby convent of Christ in the early 20th century. One note, never officially published, mentions a binding between the line and the order. The author, a lay brother named Marcos de Serra, uses language more poetic than precise. He writes, "In the Red Tower, under no flag, a bride took a vow and a knight lowered his sword. Not in defiance, in completion." Completion. That word lingers. Marriage in medieval Christian doctrine was both sacred and symbolic. The union of opposites. Of masculine and feminine, of soul and body. For the Templars, whose public face was militant chastity, such a rite would be unthinkable. And yet here it is, whispered on stone, preserved in phrase, remembered in silence. Could this be the veiled queen or one of her successors? Possibly. The tower's alignment with the lunar solstice has led some fringe theorists to speculate that it was used for ritual observation timed rites, tied to feminine cycles, not ecclesiastical calendars. It also stands directly above a now sealed well whose waters were once considered healing. A 14th century traveler writing in Catalan referred to it as La Boca de la Reina, the Queen's mouth. The callback to the Magdalene orders is almost too perfect. A hidden sanctuary, a woman cloaked in silence, a rite that bends but does not break tradition. A marriage that produces no dynasty, but echoes through inheritance of ritual. This red marriage, as it's sometimes called, wasn't about possession. It was about convergence. A symbolic fusion of knight and queen, of masculine discipline and feminine wisdom. Not domination. Union. A small codex discovered in a private library in Évora, Portugal, adds one final brushstroke. It contains a short poem unattributed dated 1257. Translated from its archaic Portuguese, it reads, "She came not in white, but in rust and dusk. She brought no dowry, but a name buried in breath. He gave no sword, only silence. and beneath the tower they drank from the well, and time turned its face from them ashamed. Again the veil, again the silence, again the act of binding without the permission of Rome. In traditional Christian theology, Christ is wed to the Church, male to institution, spirit to structure. But what if in this shadowed rite, the Templars performed a parallel truth? What if their spiritual marriage was not to Rome but to her? The callback to the Templar cipher becomes more vivid now. Above the light, the cloak. Beneath the cloak, she. What if this marriage was more than romance or alliance? What if it was initiation, anointing, the transference of trust, not by document but by vow? She would not need to rule by crown or sword. She would rule by memory, by vow, by the silence shared in a tower soaked in dusk, and the red tower remains. Weather-worn, overgrown, mostly forgotten, but not erased, because somewhere perhaps the marriage still holds. They were princesses, duchesses, abbesses. Their names appear in footnotes and funerary records more often associated with scandal than sovereignty. Some never ruled, others ruled too briefly. But across medieval Europe, a peculiar pattern emerges: women of noble blood, often tied to forgotten regions, suddenly denounced, branded witches, heretics, mad, disinherited, vanished, and far too many of them had something in common: they lived near Templar commanderies. In 1271, a young woman named Isabel of Foix was stripped of her titles after rumors swirled of her nightly gatherings and foreign rites. She'd been betrothed to a Templar-affiliated baron. The engagement was broken. Within months, her estate was absorbed by the Church. Her personal chaplain, a lay brother with suspected Templar links, was burned in Narbonne. Isabel fled. No one knows where. A single letter survives hidden in a hollow wall, and found centuries later. I was not crowned, but I was chosen. She was not alone. In Tuscany circa 1310, Lady Theodora di Siena was accused of preserving a forbidden genealogy. She'd been compiling a family book tracing her lineage not through her father's name, but her mother's. When interrogated, she stated calmly, "The throne belongs to the one who remembers, not the one who conquers." Her book was seized. Her final record reads, "Transferred to ecclesiastical custody." She too disappeared. These aren't isolated incidents. Over 24 noblewomen between 1180 and 1320 were accused of spiritual deviation without clear doctrinal offenses. Most had landholdings adjacent to Templar routes. Many were unmarried or unusually educated. Several were rumored to own red stones or pendants engraved with the now familiar triangle and circle motif, always dismissed as pagan trinkets, always confiscated and destroyed. This raises an unsettling question. Were these women mere targets of misogyny and suspicion, or guardians of something older? The callback to the Red Tower's silent marriage pulses beneath this question. A sacred bond unregistered by church or state could not pass power in the traditional sense. But what if it passed memory? What if it passed a vow? And what if these women scattered across Europe were torchbearers of the veiled queen's lineage, not by blood necessarily, but by right? The term cursed becomes a camouflage. What cannot be crowned is instead condemned. What cannot be recognized is erased. But always the pattern returns. Women silenced, estates confiscated, writings destroyed, and always near Templar soil. The Church's records are notably sterile. Most files list the accusations with the same phrasing: refused counsel, held private rights, spoke of unlawful sovereignty. The charges are vague, the evidence thin. But the verdicts are unanimous. The verdict was always exile or execution. In 1294, a noblewoman named Elvira de la Peña stood trial in Toledo. She was charged with leading nocturnal vigils and reciting incantations not in the name of the Virgin, but of the unknown mother. Under torture, she reportedly muttered a single phrase over and over: "She sleeps beneath the veil of the world." When asked to elaborate, she wept and fell silent. The callback to the cipher's warning is unmistakable, for in her naming lies the end. These women may not have known the name, but they carried the memory, the echo, and perhaps that was enough. Even into the Renaissance, the pattern lingers. Queen Juana of Castile, known later as La Loca, was confined not for her politics, but for her refusal to remarry. Her devotion to a feminine spiritual practice she refused to renounce became the backdrop to her madness. Her sealed journals, opened only centuries later, contained drawings of a veiled figure seated within a circle of 12 stars. No saint, no mother, a ruler, alone. If this is coincidence, it is remarkably consistent. If it is not, then the implications are profound, because it means the veiled queen did not die with the Templars or fade with the Grail legends. She continued, fragmented, disguised, embedded in the memories of women who dared remember when it was safer to forget. Each branded, broken, buried. Not because they were dangerous, because they knew something sacred. The callback to the white scroll becomes sharper now. Perhaps it was not lost. Perhaps it was divided. Perhaps each cursed daughter was entrusted with a fragment, an oath, a symbol, a ritual. And perhaps their exile was never defeat. Perhaps it was design. She would not be seen through lineage. She would be carried through vow, through silence, through the ones who were never crowned but always chosen. In a quiet maritime museum along the Scottish coast, largely ignored by tourists and overshadowed by castles and clan histories, rests a ship's hull dated to the late 13th century. The vessel, weathered, fractured, and partially reconstructed, is known locally as the Saint's Flight. Official records call it a trading ship of unknown origin, discovered buried beneath layers of peat near the village of Nig. But carved into its central mast, brace preserved by brine and time, is a symbol that doesn't belong to any merchant guild or noble house. It's not even Christian. It is a triangle encircled by 2 looping rings, and within it a small starburst, 8-pointed, with a faint vertical line descending like a thread. The symbol is a match, identical to the glyph found in the Codex Eberensis, echoed in the ring of the Delbellan family, whispered in the cipher. It is the lady's mark. What was it doing on a ship? The official answer, when one is offered, is that it's simply decorative, a sailor's carving, perhaps a good luck charm. But the ship's construction tells a different story. The wood is Portuguese pine reinforced with iron braces common to Templar naval craft. The design notably lacks any clear armament or capacity for cargo. And on the inside of the hull, barely visible beneath layers of restoration resin, lies a hand-painted inscription, Ad lumen et silentium, toward the light and the silence. Not a merchant's motto, a dedication. The Templars, known mostly for their land-based operations, did in fact operate a fleet. Their naval base in La Rochelle served as a strategic port, especially during the later Crusades. But much of their maritime activity remains mysterious. Some ships vanished after the order's fall, never accounted for in church or crown inventories. Some believe they fled with treasure. Others say they fled with knowledge. This ship, the Saint's Flight, may have carried something stranger still. Local oral history claims the ship's crew were priests without crosses, and that a woman wrapped in the morning sky was seen boarding the vessel shortly before a storm took it down. Her name, if she had one, was never spoken, only that she bore no face and cast no shadow. Poetic exaggeration, no doubt. But the imagery is unmistakable. In 1974, during a restoration of the ship's lower beams, a hidden compartment was found beneath the planking, too small for cargo, too delicate to be for weapons. Inside, a fragment of cloth wrapped around a smooth stone etched with the same lady's mark. The cloth was tested. The dye, made from crushed woad and rare alpine berries, dated roughly to the 1200s and bore faint embroidery at its edge, 12 stars in a ring stitched in gold. 12 again. 12 stars echoing the circle beneath the Queen's throne in the Gisor's fresco. Echoing the symbols on Magdalene garments. Echoing the pattern etched around the base of the Black Madonna of Rocamadour. This is no coincidence. If the ship was real and its cargo symbolic, then it suggests the veiled queen was not a stationary presence confined to secret rites and stone chambers. She moved. She traveled. Perhaps not she herself, but her emissaries, her lineage, her voice. And she did so protected by the Templars, not just as warriors, but as navigators of hidden truths. A document recovered from the Vatican's suppressed Templar files, labeled only Item 47, includes a translated transcript of a lost confession from a knight named Henri de Vannes. In it, he describes transporting a veiled vessel across the sea, bound not for Jerusalem, but for the island of mists. He refers to his cargo as not relic nor gold, but what must never fall to the Roman flame. Most interpreted this as metaphor or madness. But if that ship reached Scotland, if that carving was her mark, and if that cloth belonged to one of her chosen, then the vessel was not just symbolic. It was a person, a presence, a secret made flesh. The callback to the silent marriage at the Red Tower is hard to ignore. That rite was one of convergence. This journey may have been one of escape, or preservation, or perhaps delivery to a land outside papal reach where the Queen's rights could be renewed beneath different skies. The location of the find, too, is significant. The coast near Nig lies within the historical boundaries of Pictish territory, an ancient culture known for its warrior women, its love of symbols, and its haunting silence in recorded history. Could her story have merged with theirs? Could she have taken root in the mists, transformed again, possibly? But more importantly, the ship proves one thing: the veiled queen's influence moved with the Templars, not only in bloodlines and rites, but across borders and oceans. She was not confined to the vaults of France or the hills of Iberia. Her presence was fluid, navigated, preserved in cloth stone symbol and the still-breathing silence of a ship they tried to forget. They called her cursed. They called her myth. But she was never still. She sailed. Two symbols etched again and again across Templar relics, too often dismissed as decorative: the mirror and the sword. Not side by side, not in conflict, intertwined. In tapestries, they cross like branches. In scroll margins, they spiral toward each other. One reflects, one cuts. And at their nexus, almost always a veiled figure, sometimes seated, sometimes gesturing, always silent. It's easy to overread symbols. Historians caution against projection. But these two elements, one of self-awareness, one of force, appear too consistently and too deliberately to be ignored. Especially when you follow them into places the Church never expected anyone to look. A stone relief recovered from the ruins of a Templar commandery near Apulia, Italy, offers one of the clearest examples. It depicts a knight kneeling before a cloaked figure, sword lowered, while behind her is a mirror not hung but floating. In its surface there is no reflection, only darkness. The inscription beneath reads, Via duplex, Regina abscondita. The dual path, the hidden queen, not a saint, not the Virgin, not an allegory. The presence is commanding even in worn limestone, and it is repeated in other forms: woodcuts from the Iberian frontier altar, carvings from dissolved commanderies in the Rhineland, fragments of painted frescoes discovered beneath later ecclesiastical whitewash. One particularly telling example is a 13th century manuscript illumination, now held in Prague. It shows 12 knights standing in a circle. At the center, a woman cloaked in gray, holding a sword in one hand and a hand mirror in the other. The mirror reflects not her face, but a star. Her eyes are closed. She speaks to none. This is not feminine vanity. This is control. The sword, we understand, it's the Templars' tool, the instrument of justice, defense, sacrifice. But the mirror, that's not tradition. That's something older, something unorthodox. In medieval mysticism, the mirror was both symbol and danger. To the Church, it represented pride, temptation, illusion. But in earlier traditions, Gnostic, esoteric, feminine, it meant knowledge, truth, reflection, not as sin, but as illumination. When paired with the sword, the symbolism becomes complex. Not destruction, not conquest, discernment. The sword to separate illusion from essence. The mirror to show what lies beneath the veil. Together, they imply a system of belief that values both action and inner sight. Exterior vow, interior clarity, and at the center, her. The callback to the oracle is unmistakable. She who never spoke directly but revealed. The queen behind the grail. The bride of the temple. The one whispered about in burned letters and encrypted scrolls. This image, mirror, and sword may be the most distilled expression of her ethos. Not dogma, but duality. Not domination, but direction. In a sealed document recovered from the Montségur excavation site, believed to be a Cathar commentary dated to the mid-1200s, there is an allegorical passage that reads, "He who takes up only the blade becomes blind. She who takes up only the mirror becomes lost. But one who kneels before both walks the path of the lady." Not Mary, not Magdalene, the lady, the one beneath the veil. This triad knight sword mirror is echoed again in a small bronze medallion found near La Rochelle, believed to be Templar in origin. It shows a cloaked figure in profile, her veil cascading like water, with a sword resting on her left shoulder and a mirror embedded in her chest. The iconography is unlike any sanctioned religious art of the period. It is quiet heresy forged in bronze. Even in legend, the motif persists. Breton folktales speak of a silver woman who appears to knights in the forest. She offers no rewards, no punishment, only a choice. She holds a blade and a mirror. Choose one, and the path changes. Most who take the sword vanish in battle. Those who take the mirror are never seen again, but their names are spoken in dream. This story, like the rest, was reduced to fairy tale. But fairy tales are where forbidden truths survive. The mirror and the sword were not opposing symbols. They were sacred twins, male and female, force and reflection, action and understanding. The Templars, in their secret rites, seem to have preserved this duality not as equal opposites, but as a unity made complete through her. She was never just guardian. She was the center. And as the sword was drawn in her name, the mirror reflected only those worthy to serve it. The callback to the veiled queen's silence takes on deeper weight now. She didn't shout commands. She held both instruments, one hand raised, one hand open, and the Templars, for all their militarism and mystique, may have understood something most of Christendom still doesn't. That power without reflection is tyranny, and reflection without strength is surrender. She was both. At the edge of a crumbling Templar commandery in the Languedoc region, there stands what remains of a chapel roofless vine choked its altar long since plundered. But the west wall still stands. Thick, uneven, holding secrets. In 1892, during repairs funded by a local preservation society, a mason's hammer struck something hollow behind a bricked-up arch. The wall opened like a wound, revealing a narrow chamber no wider than a corridor, and inside a sarcophagus. It was stone plain, but precisely cut sealed, not with mortar, but with a single iron band etched with unfamiliar sigils. No inscription, no cross. Only one marking on the lid, a faint triangle encircled. The officials at the time had little patience for mystery. They cracked it open within the week. What they found was not what they expected. The skeleton was female, not a relic, not a saint. A woman. Buried alone without ornament, without an epitaph. Her bones bore no signs of violence. Her hands were crossed over her chest, and at her feet a fragment of fabric remained rotted and brittle but with one corner still intact. 12 stars faintly embroidered in gold. The archaeologists dismissed the burial as anomalous. Possibly a benefactor, they said, or a noblewoman taken in during a time of plague. But none could explain why she was buried in the wall, not beneath the chapel where the knights lay, not in the surrounding cemetery, inside, entombed within the very architecture of the Templar sanctuary. A monk's record from 1301 might offer a clue. In a scriptorium journal from nearby Béziers, he records a strange event, a ceremony held under moonlight to seal the legacy of the lady as spoken in the vow of 12. He makes no mention of death, only of a closing, a passing of guardianship, a living interment. That phrase, living interment, strikes a cold chord. Could it have been symbolic, a rite of withdrawal, or something more literal? The callback to the oracle reemerges. She who did not rule from a throne but from absence. Her strength was not in dominion, but in being unseen, untouched, preserved. Perhaps this woman was not a figure to mourn. Perhaps she was a figure to contain, not in fear, but in protection. A 15th-century drawing from the Cathedral of Le Puy depicts a chapel wall marked by stars. In the margin, a note she rests in the breath between east and west. A metaphor, perhaps, or maybe directions. The Templars revered geometry. They aligned their buildings not just for function, but for meaning. East was Christ, resurrection. West was silence, mystery, the unknown. To be buried in the west wall was to become part of the threshold. A whisper found in a Scottish monastery adds weight. She who sleeps in stone shall one day unseal the veil. It's attributed to no one. The monks deny authorship, but the phrasing mirrors the cipher's rhythm, that quiet cadence of warning wrapped in prophecy. Whoever this woman was, she was not hidden casually. Her tomb was not humble. It was precise, designed, deliberate. In her hands, the skeletal remains bore something peculiar. Not a rosary, but a thin rod of carved bone decorated with shallow notches that, when translated into Templar code, read expectere, custodier, to wait, to guard. The callback to the burned letters returns like a tremor. She who commands without name. She whose seal bore no crown, yet men knelt. If this was her, if even one of the traditions is true, then she was not only remembered, but interred by the very ones she led. And not just anywhere. In the wall, in the structure, in the bones of the order itself. A final clue emerged in 1934 when a historian examining the site discovered a set of initials scratched faintly into the stone adjacent to the tomb. Not Latin, not Greek, Aramaic. The translation was simple light beneath stone. It doesn't prove anything. But it makes you wonder. Because if the veiled queen's presence was preserved anywhere, it would not be in glass cases or royal vaults. It would be in a place no one thought to look. A space that could not be catalogued or claimed. A wall. A silence. A burial not of death, but of continuity. She may never have worn a crown, but they built their chapel around her. And she never left. In 1627, an archivist working in the Apostolic Library of the Vatican catalogued a peculiar entry in his private journal. Not a manuscript, not a scroll. A seal sigillum described as of foreign origin Templar in shape, yet bearing a crowned woman flanked by double crosses. The note is brief, more an afterthought than an official entry. But it contains a phrase rarely used in those circles, non adibendum, not to be used, a forbidden seal. The object itself has never been displayed. No image survives. No inventory includes it. But the journal recovered in 1902 by Jesuit scholars researching banned iconography contains enough detail to identify it as something more than decorative. The archivist sketches a rough diagram, a veiled figure seated upon a throne shaped like an open book. In her right hand, a sword turned downward. In her left, a flowering branch. Surrounding her 12 stars again, always 12, and beneath her feet, an inscription almost erased, Regina Ordinis Templi, Queen of the Order of the Temple. This is not church art. This is not homage. This is hierarchy. The reaction within the Vatican appears to have been swift. Later entries from the same archivist shift tone entirely. His writing grows cautious, his notes guarded. One final entry, written in a shaky hand, reads, "It was shown to me once, and then never again. I was told it has no context, no origin, and no place within these walls." He was reassigned shortly after, sent to a remote post in Dalmatia. The seal vanished, but its trace lingers. A curious footnote in an internal Inquisition document from 1731 references the sealed item bearing feminine blasphemy. The document is vague, but the context is unmistakable. It refers to items too dangerous to burn, yet too symbolic to destroy. Stored, locked, forgotten on purpose. This aligns with a long-standing Vatican protocol, relicta silenti, objects not condemned, but sealed into silence. Items assigned neither meaning nor destruction. They simply cease to be spoken of. The callback to the buried woman in the west wall is immediate. She too was sealed, not condemned, but preserved. These are not accidents. These are systems, designs. The presence of a seal, an official emblem, suggests something extraordinary. That at some point, however briefly, the veiled queen was not only known, but acknowledged. Not as myth, as office. The seal implies jurisdiction, authority. The very tools used by the papacy to bind and declare were in this one case shaped around her, and then hidden. The seal's imagery combines elements from earlier symbols. We've traced the throne of stars from the Geysers fresco, the downward sword from the oracle, the flowering branch reminiscent of Eastern Christian iconography used for divine feminine wisdom. It's not Templar ornamentation, it's theology rendered in sigil. That the Vatican possessed it at all is revealing. Whether it was confiscated during the order's dissolution, or recovered from a private estate, or simply passed hand to hand in the shadows of the Curia, its existence implies threat. Not just to doctrine, but to structure. To the very story Rome had worked so hard to finalize. There's a saying in archival circles, what the church silences, it fears. And silence is exactly what surrounds the sigillum. No official policy, no condemnation, no images. Just one sketch, one phrase, one reassignment. The callback to the cipher's caution, now lands like a warning bell. She must not be named, for in her naming lies the end. Was the sigillum the last attempt to define her, to contain her within the language of seals and thrones and scrolls? Did someone in the brief moment before history turned to ash try to preserve her in the only way the Church might understand, if so it failed? Because she was never meant to be stamped, or titled, or filed away. And yet the seal lingers, not in vaults, in echoes. It appears in subtle tracings on forgotten murals, in etched rings kept in family crypts, in the margins of texts written by hands too careful to sign. A Templar knight once whispered, "Her power lies not in presence, but in the loyalty of those who never speak her name." Perhaps this sigillum was a final gesture, a quiet nod to that loyalty. A way of saying, "We remember, even if we may never speak, and now you know." There is a seal they tried to forget, a queen they refused to crown, and an emblem buried in stone and silence that still marks the border between the world we know and the shadow she built. The windswept heights of Montségur are littered with stone and silence. Here in the final stronghold of the Cathars, those so-called perfect ones who defied Rome and paid in flame history, is reduced to ruins. Yet beneath those ruins lie tombs, and within those tombs, whispering bones. The Cathars were condemned as heretics, but their beliefs, while radical, were coherent. Dualists, purists. They rejected the material world, refused the cross, spoke of a divine feminine presence, an emanation of God beyond Scripture. They were slaughtered not for blasphemy alone, but for holding a version of Christendom the Church could not control. And within their cosmology stood a figure rarely discussed today, La Reina de Lum, the Queen of Light. Not Mary, not Magdalene, someone else. The Queen of Light appears in a handful of Cathar oral traditions preserved by troubadour songs and inquisitorial transcripts. She is described as the guide behind the veil, she who speaks in dreams, and curiously, the bride the knights remember. A 14th-century inquisitor named Pierre de Celano recorded one especially troubling confession from a captured Cathar elder who claimed that the Templars once came here not for gold, but for her name. When asked who she was, the old man replied, "The one who came before Rome, the one who never kneeled." The story was discarded as madness. The elder was burned. But his words linger in the margins of the transcript scribbled in a different hand. Is this the Lady of the Western Chapel? That phrase, Lady of the Western Chapel, matches a separate reference in the Templar cipher. A place, or perhaps a role. It has no official meaning in church architecture. And yet, in the small Cathar crypts scattered across Occitania, it appears again carved into the lintels, etched into candle niches buried beneath loose stones. A triangle, a veil, 12 stars, always 12. In 1967, during an unofficial excavation of a Cathar site near Minerve, a stone reliquary was unearthed. It contained ashes, a bronze medallion, and a slip of parchment wrapped in oilcloth. The parchment bore a single sentence in faded Occitan: "She lives in the breath between shadow and fire." The phrase has no liturgical origin. But to those tracing the legacy of the veiled queen, it reads like a declaration. The callback to the West Wall burial is immediate. The woman encased not beneath, but within. As if to say she is not to be entombed, she is to become the wall, the threshold, the breath itself, and that breath moves. The Cathars spoke of her not as past, but as waiting. Much like de Molay's whisper, much like the coded confessions that ripple beneath the Church's redacted scripts. Her story, according to Cathar tradition, was never written. It was sung, low, secret, passed through melodies that bent vowels like winding paths. Not lyrics, but maps. One of these songs, preserved by a line of clandestine Occitan bards, includes the verse, "She bore no cross, but stars on her brow. She rode no horse, but tides of vow. She spoke no word, yet all did bow to she who guards the light." The church never burned this song. They never found it. Perhaps because they never thought to look among the songs of outlaws and exiles, among tombs not marked by name but by echo. Perhaps because they were too focused on stamping out the body to hear what the bones had memorized. The callback to the oracle is unmistakable. Like the Cathar Queen of Light, she was a vessel of wisdom, not rulership. She didn't demand obedience. She revealed purpose. She did not anoint with oil, but with understanding. Could the Cathars have preserved her memory after the Templars fell? Or did the two traditions always run in parallel, two rivers of descent, winding beneath the same empire, never touching, but always aware? Perhaps the Veiled Queen is not a single person at all, but a lineage of remembrance. A ritual passed hand to hand, mother to daughter, night to sister, ash to breath. A presence carried by those whom the church feared precisely because they could not be discredited. Only erased, but she was never fully erased. She still sings in the ruins of Montségur, where nothing remains but wind and stone and silence that leans toward you if you wait long enough. And if you listen closely beneath the howling and the emptiness, there it is. 12 stars, one veil, no cross, only light. Not in legend, not in fire, but in patterns. She is not worshipped now, at least not overtly. No feast day bears her name. No prayers are offered in public chapels, and yet she returns, quietly, persistently. Through symbols etched in back corners of esoteric texts in whispered rites that don't call themselves rituals in the way certain women stand still in moments when everything else is moving. The Veiled Queen has never truly left. Across Europe and into the Americas, small enclaves of esoteric communities, some ancient, some modern, continue to reference an unnamed feminine force. Sometimes she's spoken of as wisdom, sometimes as the Lady of 12, occasionally as the Queen who waits. But the imagery remains strangely consistent, a figure shrouded in gray, surrounded by stars, holding no weapon but presiding over all. She's never quoted. She's only remembered. In 1998, a group of researchers cataloging Gnostic revivalist texts discovered a hand-copied volume in an antique shop in Girona. Inside were fragments of translated Occitan prayers. One addressed the she who gave the sword to silence and the mirror to memory. The phrase doesn't match any known religious structure, but to those who know the Templar cipher, the mirror and sword are unmistakable signals. The book was unsigned. No author, no title. Just a final phrase at the end, Custodia Domini. The lady is guarded. The callback to the cipher sharpens again. In the forests of Lithuania, folklorists have recorded pagan-Christian hybrid traditions that include moonlit vigils led by a woman who wears a veil embroidered with a triangle and 12 small flowers. In Romania, a mural uncovered in a burned wooden chapel depicts a robed woman seated not on a throne, but on a coiled serpent flanked by 2 knights. The painting, undated, had been whitewashed, yet survived beneath soot and layers of lime. Even in modern esoteric circles, the echo persists. In certain Freemasonic rites, long deemed apocryphal, there exists a rumored 13th degree. The veiled regent never practiced publicly, never confirmed in records. Those who speak of it say the initiate must vow silence not only about the ceremony, but about who presides. That she is present, but never visible. The rite reportedly ends with the phrase, "She, who was never crowned yet, for whom the throne was made. And perhaps most unsettling of all, a 2007 art installation in Prague, titled The Templar's Mirror, intended as a meditation on lost symbols, was shut down within a week by church-affiliated protesters. The central piece was a life-sized sculpture of a woman seated within a triangle of obsidian mirrors. Her face obscured her robe, stitched with 12 stars. The artist never revealed the inspiration, only saying, "She came to me through silence." The callback to the oracle's role feels complete now, not as a prophet of the past, but as a bridge into the present. Her gift was never prediction, it was preservation. A stillness so total it echoed into future generations without the need for voice. This is the truth the church could never touch. You can burn scrolls, you can erase names, but you cannot unremember a presence once it enters the rhythm of breath. Once it becomes the instinct to bow in darkness, to kneel without being told, to feel watched not in threat but in protection. The veiled queen returns in patterns, in 12 stars on the ceiling of a chapel rebuilt after war, in the sudden hush that falls in a room when a story passes too close to truth, in the architecture of initiation, whether spiritual, political, or personal. Because in the end, she was never about domination. She was about inheritance. Not by blood, by memory. She returns every time someone sees beyond what's offered, every time a relic is found and questioned, every time a woman chooses silence over spectacle and is misunderstood as passive rather than powerful. Her throne was never gilded. It was woven of silence. Her crown not gold, but knowing. Her army not armored men, but the generations who carry her quietly through poems, through music, through the unbroken thread of questions that refuse to die. She doesn't rise in fire. She returns like breath on glass. And those who remember her, they were never alone. So now we arrive at the final question, not whispered, but spoken plainly. Was she real? Did a woman once stand behind the order of the temple, not beside it, not beneath it, but above it? Did knights of the most powerful military brotherhood in Christendom bend the knee to a veiled queen whose name never made it into sanctioned records? Or was she something else entirely? History rarely affords us clarity, especially when it comes to those who were never meant to be remembered. The evidence, fragmented though it is, builds a compelling architecture. A woman appears on an early seal. She vanishes. A ritual is described featuring a veiled bride. A lineage in southern France insists they descend from someone known only as La Reine Voilée. A hidden chapel, a forbidden sigillum cryptic whispers at executions, erased documents, crypts, and songs and murals that all point to something someone deliberately excised. The weight of erasure itself becomes testimony. It would be easier to dismiss all this as myth, to say the Templars were men of the sword, not servants to mystery. That such a woman is too romantic a projection, perhaps a symbol, perhaps an archetype, but not a person of flesh and power. Easier still to claim that the traces we've seen were coincidence, confusion, the overreading of iconography. But then the question turns, if she was only an idea, why work so hard to bury her? Rome has never feared metaphors. It fears influence. It fears loyalty unaccounted for, especially when it moves beneath the surface. So what if the veiled queen was both? What if she was real once and then became more a woman in a specific time and place who gave voice, guidance, perhaps even commands to a generation of Templars? Perhaps she held no title. Perhaps she wasn't called queen until after she vanished. Perhaps the name was granted by those who followed her in secret. And in the centuries that followed, her story became interwoven with ritual myth and longing. Not a distortion, an evolution. She became a force, a code. A whisper passed among those who could never find her tomb because she was never meant to be buried. The callback to the lady in the west wall remains vital, because even if the bones belonged to someone else, even if the burial was symbolic, the point stands: she was not hidden in obscurity. She was honored in shadow, and this is what separates her from every other erased woman in the Church's long war on memory. She was never just a victim. She was a structure, a presence, a living breach in the wall that the Church tried to build between divine authority and feminine being. The Queen was not fiction. She was function. Whether as matriarch, oracle, mother of the light, or sovereign guide, her imprint shaped the very architecture of the Templars' most sacred rites. She offered no sermons. She issued no bulls. She ruled through absence, and in doing so became a mirror. To those who needed a cause, she was it. To those who needed permission, she gave it. To those who needed silence, she became the voice they no longer needed to hear out loud. So was she real? The only answer that matters is this: she is still here. Now breathe. Let it all go quiet. You've walked a long corridor through silence and shadows, through seals and songs, through names almost lost and symbols barely remembered. And at the end of that corridor stands no throne, no coronation, no final revelation, just a stillness. And in that stillness, her. Not as a queen seated on a jeweled seat, not as a warrior clutching a sword, but as something softer, something truer. You never saw her face. You never heard her speak, but you felt her. Maybe that was the point. Power, the kind that leaves no scars and builds no monuments, doesn't announce itself. It watches, it guides, it outlasts. And if you look back, every clue, every chapel, every cipher, every torn manuscript wasn't about proving her existence. It was about recognizing her influence. A woman who needed no name because her presence was carried by those who remembered, not in books, but in breath. She was never meant to wear the crown. She was the reason it was forged. So let your eyes soften. Let the veil fall not over her, but over the noise. Let the memory of her move through you, not as doctrine, but as hush, as weightless certainty. She ruled nothing, and she held everything. Good night, listener, and may the Queen walk with you, unseen.